everybody, I am Cinnamon Cooney, your Art Sherpa, and today I'm going to show you everything you need to know as a beginner about acrylic paint. This whole video is going to just cover those basic first concepts that you need to know about acrylic paint. This is really great if you are going out shopping for the first time, if you're new to the medium, if you're changing from one medium to another. It's part of a course for beginner acrylic painting. It's a whole course. You can watch this video in and of itself if this is all the information you need. If you'd like to know everything there is to know about beginner acrylic painting, you can join the whole course. To help me do this is my husband, John.
Hello.
He's my fabulous co-host, and he makes sure that everything is working as it should be most of the time.
Most of the time.
If you're here for the live, we want to say hi. Thank you for coming and joining us. Be sure to put your questions all in caps. If you miss the live shows, these are always here on replay. You can ask anytime, any year. Just put the questions in the comments below. You don't have to put them in caps, and we will try to get them answered. If you need something urgently, you can write support@theartsherpa.com. So if you think this whole free series of acrylic painting courses is cool, or you just really like this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, especially if you have a question. That's really, really important to me. You can find the whole course if that was interesting to you, like, ooh, a free beginner acrylic painting course. That's easy to locate on our website, so that way you can go through all the videos really, really easily from beginning to end. And at the end, you can even get a certificate of achievement.
Yay!
Yay! All right, so when we come back, I'm going to tell you what's great about acrylic paint and what sucks about acrylic paint, so as a beginner, you can know what you're getting into. So in this segment, I am going to share with you my experience of acrylic paint and teaching beginners, and I'm going to tell you what's great about that for beginning a new artist and what is the suck about that for beginning a new artist. I'm going to give you the pros and the cons. That way, when you come on board, and I'm sure you're going to come on board to paint with this medium, you're kind of going to know what you're getting into, right? A lot of times, if you can manage expectations, you can really enjoy the journey more. So I'd like to tell you what is awesome about acrylic paint. The pros, John. The good, before we get to the bad and the ugly, the good. So one of the best things about acrylic paint is that it has a variety of prices for everybody's budget. It really literally goes from like $1 to, at the highest range ever for Yinmin Blue, $100. Most of it is well under 10. For most of the paint that's out there that you run into as a hobbyist, it's under $10. So it's a very good variety of prices from entry to professional. It's really amazing in that way. Because it doesn't have a lot of solvents, unusual chemicals, or expensive like tools and materials, it's really easy for you to do at home. You don't have to go to a special location or class. You don't have to have a lot of special ventilation. For the most part, you can do it in your house very, very easily. Also, the other thing I like for beginners, and on the time that I've been online, I found it's really easy for you guys to learn. You pick up the techniques very quickly, and there's just a low barrier to entry there. It's available a lot of places, so it's one of those things that you can kind of get anywhere. There's a ton of quality education for it. Even though this medium has only been around in the form that we kind of know it now from around the 1950s on, there's just a ton of education. It's very popular. And when a medium is popular, that means you guys get a lot of good free education. It's very versatile. Acrylic can look like other mediums. So it can look like oils. It can look like watercolors. It does a lot of techniques. And there's a lot of mediums that you can add to acrylic to do even more things. So the well of creativity is very deep, and you can take it far. It's like even into multimedia. This just does everything really for you. One and done kind of medium. Comes in a ton of colors. So one of the things that can be problematic from one medium to another is there's not a lot of colors, but acrylic has almost all the colors that oil painting has. It paints on most things, from rocks to windows to canvas. Just paints on stuff, and you don't have to do a lot of prep. You know, not a lot of media. You don't have to do a lot of substructure. It dries super quickly, so you're not waiting months for your painting to be dry. Thins with water. You don't have to buy a lot of solvents. It's going to thin with water. And the dried paint, if it dries on something, it can be removed with rubbing alcohol, so you don't have to buy a really toxic solvent to get it off of something. It's going to do a lot of techniques really well, like dry brushing or thick painting, kind of better than any other medium. And what's nice is from craft paint to professional paint, you can do all the mediums and all the bodies. They intermix. So it's really nice in that way. and for the most part is non-toxic. There's a couple exceptions to that, and we'll talk about that later, but for the most part, it's one of the more beginner-friendly paints in that way. Now, I got to tell you about the bad, though, the cons. What's wrong? The suck. Okay, so we mentioned that it dries fast, and that's kind of nice because you're not waiting months in the way you might be with oils for a painting to dry. That's also the suck. A lot of beginners, one of their first frustrations, and you can't overcome it, but one of the first frustrations is the paint is drying really quick and you're having trouble blending it. So that technique is harder to work out in acrylic, but I've taught a lot of beginners and you can overcome it. It can be reactivated. So once it's dry, it's dry. You're not going to come back and blend a dry area. Dry is dry. It's made of polymers and pigments, and so there's a little bit of extra care in disposing the paint. We talked about that in the previous video if you want to check that out. And you can see that, we talk about paint disposal and water disposal. So there's just a little extra care than maybe you would do over watercolor. Has some temperature sensitivity. It doesn't really like extreme cold or extreme hot. It's a very narrow range, not really that narrow, but it just doesn't want to be frozen and it doesn't want to be heated. And when it's warm, the paintings can kind of stick together, and it's sort of a problem. This problem, it's kind of hard in painting, I think, in all painting, but there's not a uniform standard that is mandatory in the industry in fine art painting. And so, like, if you have burnt sienna in one company, it may not look exactly like the burnt sienna of another company. All standards are voluntarily entered into. So paint company has to voluntarily enter in safety and color and light fast standards. We'll tell you that about reading a tube of paint. It doesn't intermix with oils. You can't have oils and acrylics and intermix them together when they're wet. You can paint oil on acrylic, like on dry acrylic, you can paint oil over dry acrylic. You cannot paint acrylic over dry oil, and you shouldn't intermix oil brushes with acrylic brushes.
No.
And the brushes will wear out faster than in other mediums for a variety of reasons. The pH is, kind of really high, and it kind of breaks down the hairs and fibers if you're using natural bristles, and it gets up in the ferrule. Bunch of little reasons. Easy stuff to work around, but it's just something to know that a watercolor brush is going to last a long time. Acrylic brush will have to be replaced much more often. Also, because it's so popular, there's a ton of misinformation. So just like there's quality education, there's also a lot of people out there giving tips and tricks that are really wrong and sometimes dangerous.
Yes.
So you have to be, as the student, a little bit kind of buyer or student beware and check some of these tips and make sure that everything that's being suggested to you is safe or will work, right? Because like an example would be glue in your paint. Glue should not be added to your paint. And we'll get into why a little bit later, why that's true. But I mean, there's just a lot of tips out there. Okay. When we come back, we're going to talk about, we're going to get back into focusing on the awesome of why acrylic paint is special. Acrylic paint is pretty special, and it's because it's almost a chameleon. It is the many faces of paint. It can almost be everything. And that's one of the things as a beginner I really want you to understand is it comes in so many types of paint, from inks to thick paints. It works like a watercolor sometimes. It works like an oil other times. It is water soluble, which means you thin it with water instead of solvents. And that can make it a lot easier to use in your home. Now, in my previous video, I covered some important information about how to dispose paint water and dried paint. But really, when you look at what's out there, it's a much easier paint to use just overall for this type of paint. And I think it just gets better and better. It also just has so many mediums and accessories and things. And it's versatile. I cannot tell you how versatile it is. Like, as a beginner, you will have no idea how versatile acrylic paint is. But as you paint, you'll realize that if you love this medium, it's not something that you're going to be over in a second. It's going to carry with you your whole life and always be useful for you in so many projects. So I really want you to have in your mind that it's a chameleon and it can do almost anything. So a lot of people aren't really clear on what acrylic paint is, right? It's an acrylic polymer emulsion. And what that basically means is that a pigment is put into an acrylic polymer with a lot of other chemicals to make it be a paint. And I'm going to cover what those are really quick, So you understand why I am always discouraging students from adding like home kitchen chemistry into their paint. And when you hear this as a beginner, you will avoid that very common mistake and really understand why that's true. In paint, there's a pigment and a binder, right? And because these paints are water soluble and pigments are less dense than water, a dispersant is required when you're mixing the paint to make sure that what it says is dispersed through the paint. One of the magics of acrylic paint is that it dries at room temperature, and that's because it has a chemical in it that's an initiator. That is the process that's going to allow the product to dry. Also in the paint are buffers such as ammonia, and that gets the pH between 8 and 10. Remember I mentioned that the pH was high, so it was hard on your brushes, but that's also what makes everything stable over time. So you have surfactants to do particle stabilization, and then you have defoamers to counterbalance the foaming nature of surfactants. The other thing that you have is you have preservatives to protect against the growth of microorganisms. You can get mold and things in acrylic products, but they do put products in that to slow that down. So that's the preservatives. And then there's thickeners to deal with something we call rheology, which is kind of like, how would you explain rheology, John?
Sort of the chemistry of how the paint components work together.
Like the way it thickens and flows, right?
And,
so when you hear artists talk about that, that's the rheology, how thick it is, how it flows. Like if it's like stringy, does it hold its body? And then stabilizers to prevent everything from falling apart if the paint freezes. So that's a lot of stuff, right? And each company, each acrylic company kind of has its own formula, its own chemists that put together proprietary bodies, right? What the chemistry of all that the pigment goes into, which is why paints are a little different from one company to another, right? There's a little artistry to this chemistry. And I think that also explains why in one company you might see paints, destabilize very quickly or separate. Other paints are buttery and flow out perfectly. And that chemistry, that formulation is why you see some differences, because some companies are better at that chemistry than others. And that is the other reason why I don't do a lot of home chemistry advice in painting, because you'll get a tip like add soap to water to improve flow. But the reason they put all those different ingredients is to prevent foaming. And soap is a foaming agent. So that's why you want to think about maybe getting mediums or products that are made for your paint to alter or change it rather than doing home chemistry. So how does this concoction dry, right? So a lot of paint, like oils, they kind of like cure over time. In watercolor, there's sort of an evaporation and binding into the paper process. But acrylic emulsions are made from all of that stuff. And during the drying process, as the water evaporates, there's sort of like a spherical particle that on top of the pigment that starts to join together in a honeycomb. And there's a bit of porosity. And that's where some of the information around varnishing can seem a little bit, even in my life, I've heard different things, right? Because a lot of times you were varnishing to deal with the porosity of the paint from when it was dry. You varnish to like improve color, like to brighten color and so it's beautify, to increase the longevity of it so that it doesn't fade, and also to address the porosity. Now, what has been kind of new is that a lot of the companies that look at archivalness in paint are saying that maybe on acrylic, varnishing is not absolutely essential. You would only varnish as a beginner. I wouldn't even worry about it until you're a little further along, because that's where everything can go crazy in your paintings. But when you hear people talk about it being important to varnish, it's beautification and longevity in the paint, but it's also to address the porosity, which may or may not be that big of a deal in it. So I think you can put a pin in the worry of varnish until later, until you're a little more familiar with the product. Another thing that I want to add about drying is your paintings are dry if you're painting in thin applications, 24 to 48 hours completely dry after you painted. But if you paint very thick, You'll hear the word impasto. That means to paint thick. That can take weeks to dry. So the thickness of the paint, even though it will look dry to you on the surface, and it may even feel dry to you, and for the purposes of painting layers on it, it's dry. But you really want to give a painting, if you are going to varnish, at least 24, 48 hours to completely dry. And if it's thick, you want to wait a really good bit and let it completely stabilize. There's a lot of acrylic paint out there. The shelves are full of everything from little craft bottles to really mysterious tubes. The price ranges are really big, and it's hard to know as a brand new artist what any of it is and what you should even buy. So let me explain some basic art families or paint families so it makes a little more sense to you in the store. The first thing to know is that acrylic paint comes in 3 levels. 3, 2, 1. We're going to go backwards. 3 is professional. 2 is artist grade, and 1 is student. Those names don't really mean anything the way that you think that they do, but basically what they're talking about is the quality of product in the container, right? So you could be not a professional and use professional paint, and you could be professional and use student paint, but it's about what's in the container, and that describes the aspect of the price. Does that make sense, John?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so better is 3. 3 is the professional, and 1 is the student. And some companies have lines where they have a professional line. Like one of my very favorite companies, Senellier, has a pro line to an artist grade line. And so, that's variety, same pigment, really quality, but some companies offer that so that you can grade up and grade down as your budget allows. Craft bottle versus artist paint. So there's some weird, sometimes, not often, hostility between the artist paint towards craft bottle paint, but I'm going to tell you right now, craft paint is real paint. If you just go forward in life and just know craft paint is real paint, and there are real artists that use craft paint. So none of those things are true, and you don't have to worry about it. Craft paint has aspects and qualities, and you want to be aware of that as a painter so that you have a good experience. Like many craft paints don't have good color mixing, and so you've got to look for their line or series that's designed for an artist painting experience. And most of them do have that. You can go on their website and find their different products and lines, and they'll have a line of craft paint for artists so you can paint along with any lesson that you want. Student grade. What do we know about that? That would be our level 1, our entry. So student grade is the lowest pigment to binder ratio. Uniformity is not such a big thing. Fluidity is, kind of random. It tends to be, in my experience, a little softer in its body because they can't put as much money into the rheology of the paint. And sometimes student colors are not equivalent to professional colors. Like the cad red hue in a student paint does not look like cad red professional paint. They're like red families, but that's about the relationship they have. However, they have budgets, and I know really good artists that use them because they like their transparency and they like their fluidity. And as long as you go into it knowing that you might have to do 2 or 3 coats to cover an area, it can be a really good product for you, just understanding that those are your challenges. Artist grade. A lot of people work in the artist grade. Sometimes they call this Economy Pro. Very often they will have near to same pigments as the professional line, right? So where it might change, as I mentioned, cadmium, they might not use pure cadmium pigment, but the quality of pigments and the amount of pigments will be really nice, and they have better rheology and a similar amount of pigment in the binder. It may be a little more leveling. The one I like to use doesn't level, but that's what you might see is like leveling means that as it dries, it shrinks. So in student, you'll see big shrinkage. In artist grade, you'll see less shrinkage. But that's like one of those things. And maybe the colors are a little muted. Maybe they are just a little bit more muted, and there's more fillers. Oftentimes they're milled. Milled is this process where it goes to the mill. Maybe we can find milling videos, right? Where they go through and paints that are milled 3 times are better. than a single milled paint. And that's another area that companies like to save money is the milling. You don't want to save money there because that's the consistency of the paint and that prevents separation. So good mill, a good milling quality
Yep.
is important. And that's what you see in the artist grade and professionals, a better milling process. And so in artist quality, you don't have to, be professional professional to get into professional paint. Everybody really likes it. The issue with professional paint is the cost jumps up.
Yes.
And the reason the cost jumps up is the making of the paint requires more effort on the paint maker side. The materials are harder to source. The materials can be more expensive. There's more chemistry and science that goes into the paint. Generally, there's really amazing chemists that design really specialty lines for each of the companies. And really, there's very little binder. You'll find that you have a lot more offerings in the types of paint that you get from like high flow to a heavy bodied. So there'll be more choices, colors super vibrant. Prices can be crazy. Why are the prices so crazy? So in the professional line, one of the ways you'll know you're getting student is all one price.
Right.
It's one price. Often in the artist grade or economy pro, it's again a very almost uniform price. Very rarely will have a variance in price. In professional paints, prices go crazy. And what that is there's something called a series. And the lower the number on the series, at least they were consistent in this. The lower the number on the series, the less expensive and difficult the pigment is to source and make, with the exception of phthalo blue, which apparently is the hardest pigment to make in the factory. I learned that from Golden Paint. But for the most part, it's easier to get. The higher the cost goes, maybe the pigment is more dangerous to work with, like cadmium pigment when it's powdered is more dangerous for the paint manufacturer. So that paint's going to be much more money in the tube than a hue, which is a color that is like the pigment, but is not the pigment. Mm-hmm. Right? So sometimes if you're like, I don't want to use that pigment, you can find a hue. And that's a good way to use professional paints, but maybe drop your cost. And also you want to see my set up your studio thing because I've got a lot of great like save money tips. You can get like better stuff. And I will say that the most important paint to think about maybe upgrading into to the best quality that you can afford is the titanium white. That's the first one, right? So that's something. And another tip there I will say is it's nice. In my paint recommendations, I'm going to give you a couple companies that go from student to pro. And I think that's nice because as you paint and you find that you love it more, you can upgrade your paints, but see similar color stories across the paint company, which is kind of fun. All right, so let's come back and we're going to talk about the other deep well, which is the body of the paint and what that means. One of the things that is confusing to beginners is this word paint body, right? Because paint doesn't have a body, no arms, no legs, no eyes, no ears, no body. But it does. It has a body. And so I'm very quickly go through it and explain what the different bodies are. First is heavy bodied. I paint with heavy bodied. I modify that body with water. Heavy body paint is thick. It's very thick. And whatever you brush it out, however you palette knife it out, it stays exactly how you put it. It doesn't shrink as it dries. It's heavy bodied. And if I want to change that thickness, I add water. It is the more challenging paint to blend because you have to change the body of the paint to blend the paint. After that is soft body. Now, soft body is a slightly smoother paint. The abstract acrylic paint that I like so much is heavy bodied, but it has a little more softness in the body. You'll hear me talk about that, right? So there's soft bodied paints, and they're kind of like yogurt. Think of it as yogurt. That's a consistency of yogurt. A little more smooth, a little blendable. Fluid. That's more like a heavy cream in thickness, and you'll find those in bottles, right? So the paints in bottles that kind of flow out, and they have a nice self-leveling quality, and they're smooth. I think of those a lot of times for like the one-stroke painting or decorative toll painting would be you're looking for fluid paints. And then there's the inks, and those are exactly what you think. Those are used in airbrushes and spray methods and also in pens and those types of things. And they are just pigment in an ink body. So the body is how thick it is. I'm not going to go into like everything on that, but that's an important thing to know. So we're going to come back and I'm going to tell you one more thing about acrylic paint that I think you need to know about the types of acrylic paint there are. This is some weird things I want you to know about acrylic paints, types that are out there. So we've talked about all the bodies of traditional acrylic, which is fast dry. Also within that world is something called open paints. Open paints dry slower. Open means how long it takes the paint to dry. In other words, they'll say how open it is how long you can work the paint before it's dry. There's a whole line of paint that's actually called open, and it's 24 to 48 hours for that paint to dry, or you have to accelerate it. You can use open paints with regular acrylic paints, and all it does is shorten, it elongates the drying time of the regular acrylic and shortens the open time of the open acrylic, but they're intermixable. Interactive acrylics, they have an interlocking formula. They have some different formulations, but they're out there. A lot of people really like them, and they have slow drying additives and things. So you'll see those. I don't really teach any of those, but they're out there, and a lot of people like them, and there's courses. They have some different kind of formulations. Acrylic gouache, you'll run into that a lot, and that's if you like that kind of flat field of color. Gouache is flat, it's thickly pigmented, it's got a high brushability. You'll run into that. Acrylic gouache is not gouache. Gouache is more akin to watercolor than it is to acrylic, but there's an acrylic paint that they call gouache. Listen, all tiers of paint and all of the paints that I just mentioned, whether it's regular acrylics, all through those other types, come in tiers 1, 2, and 3. Spray cans even. 1, 2, and 3. And you can find all bodies in all tiers. So that's just a weird thing to know. So the great thing about all of that is that you can intermix heavy bodied with soft body paint or even an ink. And you can mix fast drying paints with slow drying paints. And you can mix expensive paints with inexpensive paints. They're all family. They're all friends. They're intermixable. Come back, we're going to talk to you about the package and how you read a tube paint. Acrylic paint also comes in some different packaging, right? And for the basic paint that you're going to be using, you'll be familiar with it coming in jars. Generally, that's for larger amounts. It comes in pouches and it comes in tubes. The tubes can be plastic or metal. You're looking for a tube of paint that is undamaged. Your packaging should never be damaged because that can impact the quality of the paint inside. The other thing to be aware of is that metal tubes can be damaged in shipping and putting out in display. So you really want to inspect your tube and make sure it's not bent or harmed in some kind of way. The other thing I want to talk to you guys about is how to read the packaging of the paint. To know what you're getting. So you've decided what you're going to have your paint in. The other thing you want to know is how to read this. Manufacturers can only give you information on the tube. A lot of times they don't have takeaways like pamphlets. Some do, but a lot of them don't. So there's a couple things to know about it. A tube of paint should inform you of the color, right? So sometimes that's a swatch across the tube or a print across the tube to give you an idea of the color. It should tell you the common name of the paint. So that's like a beauty name like you see in makeup, but they're traditional ones like cadmium yellow or Windsor blue. Those are common names. And then on a tube of paint should be a pigment name. And generally that's 2 letters and a number. So it'd be like PY53, pigment yellow 53. And that tells you something about the type of pigment that they source. Sometimes in a hue, you'll see a combination of those. It will tell you what the series is, which gives you a good idea if it's going to be expensive. And that's only important in the pro paints. Student paints won't tell you series. It will tell you if it's opaque or transparent. That's usually with an O or a T and a little box that lets you know. And it's going to tell you how light fast it is. And then it's going to have some safety information on it. If there's anything you immediately need to know, like don't put this in a spray bottle, they will tell you on the bottle. The other thing is you'll see, depending on where you're at, different little safety stamps, and you can see what number that applies to. You can go to those websites and look up what that is, and it'll tell you if it's light fastness standards or safety standards or pigment standards that it meets. Some tubes have several of those on there. The other thing is it'll tell you who made it and what brand it is, and that's important later. If ever you're unhappy with a product, you can generally find those companies online and reach out to them. Or if you're happy with the product, you could tell them, good job. But that's how you would find them. You want to make sure that these are undamaged and that the caps go on and off easily, right? And you deserve that as a consumer. You deserve a quality product that comes out of the package nice. So just know that's something that you deserve and you should be looking for. And you can ask that of manufacturers and you can ask that of retailers. Another thing you might not know as a beginner is how to tell if the paint's good or bad. Is it good paint or is it bad paint, right? Mm-hmm. So some basic things that you want to look for. As we mentioned, you want to make sure your packaging is undamaged because air is what ruins your acrylic paint. And what you're looking for in heavy bodied would be like a warm, buttery consistency. But whatever the body of the paint is, you want it to be fully incorporated. The pigment is intermixed into the body smoothly without separation. So it also, the other thing that you should have is that there's no weird smell. Now listen, acrylic paint obviously has some smell, but it shouldn't be a foul odor.
Right.
And I know sometimes some people are more sensitive to smell than others, but the foul odor is a really noticeable odor. It's like, whoa, what happened in that tube of paint? That is, you're done with that paint. You return it. If it's got a crazy odor, you're going to return it. Another thing to know is that the enemies of your acrylic paint are, like, to tell if it's going to go bad, are air and temperature. So like any extreme temperatures, freezing or extreme heat can affect how the paint performs. And I'm saying that because I've seen a lot of tips to put your paint in the refrigerator, and that would not be based in how acrylic paint works. So don't do that. You don't want to put it at either extreme. You know that it can go bad. Manufacturers say 5 to 7 years. Mm-hmm. You can really increase the longevity of your paint by just putting the cap back on every time you take it off. Take it off, put the paint out, put the cap back on. Separation versus cottage cheese. Remember that milling thing I mentioned earlier and the different types of rheology and products and additives in the paint, the chemistry? Some companies never have separation. You'll never see separation in the paint that I use of all the brands I recommend, and that's one of the reasons I recommend it. It doesn't do that. But some paint does separate. That does not mean the paint is bad. Separation is where you see a clear liquid and then areas of pigment, and you can just reincorporate that. Sometimes in the pouch, sometimes you can shake up a jar, sometimes you can just use an artist knife. That's reincorporating. If it's coming out like cottage cheese, I always recommend to my students that they return that. Yes, there are tricks and additives and things you can do to recover the paint, but that's not what you paid for. You didn't pay for recovering paint. So while I think like some companies tend to have separation, it's still good paint. Cottage cheese isn't something you should put up with. You take a picture of it with your phone or whatever you have, and you can return it to the store. If they tell you that's how paint's supposed to be, you can return it to the manufacturer. And that's really important. You can return bad paint. You're allowed to return bad paint. If the color's not right, if something's not right, it's crazy. Most of these companies are small and they care a lot about what they make, and your experience matters to them a lot, and they'd rather have a good tube of paint out there than you trying to struggle through a bad tube of paint. And also they need to know if there was a problem. So as long as you're reasonable when you write them, they're going to be amazing back to you. And you can find most companies online with a customer service. So you should never, ever have to deal with that in your paint. All right, when we come back, I'm going to tell you some do's and don'ts of acrylic, things to always do and things to never do. Do's and don'ts of acrylic. So things to always do, as I mentioned before, every time you open a jar or tube of paint, immediately cap it. Don't put it aside, open, and then come back and cap it later, because air is what cures the paint, and that's what's going to shorten the life of your paint in the tube. Do recap every time. Do wipe down the threads, like with a baby wipe or something. I'm terrible about this, and you will see me struggle all the time on my show. I am the cautionary tale of why you should absolutely clean your caps every time so they come on and off nicely, and they always make a nice seal. Do wash your brushes after every painting session. Acrylic paint is the big destruction of your brushes, and the best way for you to keep them alive longer is to wash them thoroughly with warm water. This is the one time you want temperature, warm water, because it helps break down paint, right? And soap, and I have some some cautionary stuff about paint and pigment disposal and water in the previous video, so I highly recommend that you watch that. Do not throw out tubes of paint that are wet. When you're disposing of your paint tubes, you're going to actually want to do the opposite of the do's and leave those caps open and open up those tubes so they're thoroughly dry. That way they don't get in the environment and anything. Do not heat your paint. Torches, no, none of that. None of it. Don't heat your paint. If you're going to put it in the dryer because you're painting clothes, walk away from the dryer. There is immediate off-gassing from acrylic paint as soon as the temperatures start to go up, and you don't want any of it in you at all. All of the Prop 65 warnings, do moderately consider the Prop 65 warning, but also not too much. So a lot of times Prop 65 warnings are good warnings for you and the consumer, but usually there are conditions for which those warnings apply, and you need to look them up specifically, like maybe contamination amounts, maybe exposure rates, maybe temperature, certain things that you're not going to be doing in your studio. But Prop 65 warnings for sure all start to come into apply if you're going to superheat your paint. Don't add oil to it. That is not going to improve it. Don't add glue. Don't freeze it. It doesn't. Some paint companies really try to prevent problems with freezing for shipping, but you don't want to be an addition to that, and it does mess with the rheology. So don't freeze it. If you're using jars, you want to pour out of the jar to another surface and seal the jar, and you don't want to add tap water to jar. Not to your jars. And if you're going to be doing gesso, which we're not going to go over in this because gesso's the next course, you don't want to get the tap water into the jar. That's where the mold comes from. And don't keep molded paint. It's not usable anymore. Once it's molded, it's done. All right, when we come back, I'm going to tell you about my favorite brands of paint and why I like them. Acrylic paint brands. There's a lot of them. I even have a blog about that lists all the acrylic paint brands I've ever found, but I certainly have not painted with all of them. I do have that blog, and it does have links to all those different websites for all over the world, but I have a few that I think are amazing, and I do recommend to you and to anyone out there. The first of those is Sennelier. Sennelier is a very old company. They still have a store in downtown Paris that you can go have paint made like the Impressionists used to go have paint made. Mm-hmm. It's fantastic. They make a professional line of paint called Acrylic. They're famous for oils. They're famous for watercolors and pastels. They make many art media. They've been in business a really long time. They have lots of educational information out there. And they have a line of paint that's easy on your pocketbook. It's like an artist grade paint, but with almost an economy paint budget. It's called Abstract Acrylic, and it comes in a pouch. I love it. I've done demos on it. Now, in all candor, I'm friends with a North American distributor. I just think he's super cool, and but I love everything about the company. I'm not biased in any other way than I just really like them, and I really like them because they make a good product. One of the things that you'll find with all the paints I recommend is they have online resources where you can reach a person. If you have questions or there's online education, there's a lot of resources for you as a student. Mm-hmm. Another brand I really like is Golden Artist Colors. So Sam Golden is one of the creators of the modern acrylic paint that we use today. He had a partner. His partner went on and made Liquitex. He made Golden Artist Colors. His son, Mark, still runs the company. They are an employee-owned company, and they're just so amazing and ethical, and they're all about artists, and they're all about making your time easier. They have a blog. If you are a new painter, please go check out the blog, justpaint.org. We'll make sure you have that here. If you go to their website, they have tons and tons and tons of information. They even have color mixing information with exact formulas. They're an amazing resource. They make an amazing product. Now they do make an oil, they make a watercolor, and they make only professional acrylic paints, but they make it in every conceivable body. And they also make custom, unique products for artists if you need to have something custom made for yourself from their special chemistry magic, and they have a factory contour. They're pretty cool, and you can always reach them. I've used them for years. I fact check myself through them just to make sure because they hire the best, sir. Holbein. Holbein is a company out of Japan. They have so many colors. They make different mediums. They make watercolor, and they make all these different paints, right? Oils, everything. They're one of the few companies that still has lead white that you can get. And they're fantastic. Fantastic colors, fantastic everything. I could only gush about them. M. Graham Artist Colors are a really great line of acrylic. I can find them online. I like them. They have good online resources. They're really terrific. Amsterdam Acrylics are amazing, and they have several lines and several bodies of paint. Matisse Deravan Acrylic, they're an Australian line.
Mm-hmm.
So weirdly cheaper in the United States than they are in Australia, and I don't really know what happened there. But they're fantastic. So if you're in Australia, that is a local paint company that you guys have, and they do really, really good work. And I did check, all of their ochre is ethically sourced.
Yeah.
So you don't ever have to worry about that. And they make some really cool stuff in a variety of bodies. And they have some really good student and everything. So there's options for you there. And then I don't know if you guys have ever heard of Artist Loft from Michaels. I don't recommend one. I don't recommend two, but I do recommend their level 3 paint. Their level 3 has got a great tube, a great cap. It's great colors. For professional line, it's not horrifying on the pocketbook. Even across the series of paints, the grades of pigment, it's pretty reasonable. And if I can't get my golden when I'm there, I can't get my Senile or a different paint when I'm there, I can grab that and know that I'm going to get good quality. So those are the ones that I recommend. PBO too. PBO is a recommended brand. They have just a lot of weird everything. PBO has a lot of weird everything. Very cool. Lots of art education, lots of community outreach, and they're fantastic, and you can get them. Those are the ones that I know are amazing companies with amazing people that I've talked to. I've had customer service need to reach out to any of them, and I have always been treated really well. On top of that, I have a big giant group where people tell me all of their experiences with everybody's paint company. And that does factor into my recommendations. If a lot of my students are not treated very well, that paint doesn't get recommended by me for any reason, not even money. So those things factor, not just my experience, but your experience at home. Those are the ones I recommend. Check out the blog if you want to see all the brands. Those are the ones that I recommend. So this is kind of like my thoughts on acrylic, and hopefully this is a good beginner introduction to the vast and wild world of acrylic paint. If you liked today's video and you thought I was helpful, I have like 1,800 other videos that might also be helpful, plus this series about beginner acrylic course. It's a whole course from beginning to end to get you painting from brush to canvas, all the stuff you need to know. So hit that like, comment, and subscribe button. Do all the little human things. Check out our websites. You can see the whole course there, and also all our 1,800 other videos, because there's just a lot of other stuff. My next class.
Yes.
Brushes. Get the brush up on brushes. And I think that's going to be a really good one. Don't miss that. So, hit that remind button on the upcoming live stream. If I somehow missed your questions in today's live, or you're coming back here on replay, because like in Australia, as I mentioned before, we're on at 3 a.m. live. That's a little unreasonable. So if you're here on the replay, I do check my questions daily. I'm about that. And so you ask your questions, even if it's years later. A lot of times I'll cache those questions on an old video. I'm really here for you guys. So be sure to put those questions in the comments. Other than that, if you're here for the live, we're going to go over to Facebook for an informal Q&A about today's video, just in case you had a unique question that I didn't answer in today's video. Keep painting, guys. Acrylic paint is fun. I hope I encouraged you to give it a try, and it gave you the information to make you an informed consumer. Be good to yourself, be good to each other. And I want to see you at an easel really soon. Bye-bye.